solar mini-grids have turned from small pilots to an electrification wave. We were there when mini-grid regulation was established. When financial transactions were closed, we saw new technology thrive and companies fail. This is where we tell the stories. This is where we discuss the future. The mini-grid business. Powered by Intersects.
Hallo, hier ist Nico. Herzlich willkommen. Hello everyone, this is Nico. Welcome to a special episode that we are releasing both in German and in English. My guest today is Sigmar Gabriel, former German foreign minister, former vice chancellor, and former chairman of the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. For many years, he was one of the most influential figures in German politics, and today he works as an author, speaker, and as chairman of the Atlantikbrücke, an organization that promotes transatlantic dialogue. Mr. Gabriel, a very warm welcome. It's a great pleasure and real honor to have you here on my podcast.
Wir sind ja Nachbarn.
We are neighbors, after all. That's true. Yes, we are. Wir sprechen heute zu, der englische Titel ist Electricity. Today we are talking about electricity and power, the geopolitics of energy independence. Mr. Gabriel is not joining us as an Africa expert, although we'll touch on Africa later, but as an experienced statesman. He has served as Germany's Minister for the Environment, for Economic Affairs and Energy, for Foreign Affairs, and of course as Vice Chancellor of the Federal Republic. He also knows the European-American relationship as few others do. I'd like to draw on that experience today, to hear your views on how valuable independence and resilience are in modern energy systems, and how important it is for countries, including those in Africa, to position themselves wisely. To begin, Mr. Gabriel, could you outline how you see the current global situation, and then we'll explore what it might mean for African nations.
Gut, was wir sehen, ist eine Auflösung der bisherigen
What we are seeing today is the slow dissolution of the world order as we once knew it, and that is, in a way, a natural process. That order was the post-war system born after the Second World War. It was shaped by the victorious powers of the time. Many of today's important countries, India, the Latin American nations, and the states of Africa, had no say in its creation. They were not at the main table. They were seated, as we say in German, at the children's table. Some were still colonies of the European empires. So the global South never really accepted that old order. For years, it has been pushing to reshape the rules of the game so its own voices carry more weight. At the same time, the superpower that once designed and maintained that system, the United States of America, no longer wants to play that role. It is turning inward, focusing on its national interests, especially on the Asia-Pacific region. From Washington's perspective, China is the great challenger. Under President Obama, the US still saw itself very clearly as the indispensable nation, the country that had to keep the world in balance and help resolve conflicts. That understanding has changed profoundly. Today, America is stepping back from that mission, and in many parts of the world, it is no longer seen as a particularly effective peacekeeper, but rather as an old imperial power. The wars it fought outside international law have not been forgotten in the global South. So two developments are happening at the same time. First, a new self-confidence in many countries of the global South that no longer accept a Western-dominated order. And second, the withdrawal of the traditional hegemon from its former global responsibilities. In practice, Washington now prefers bilateral agreements and often regards multilateral institutions as almost superfluous. A complete reversal of how American foreign policy used to think. These are massive, deeply unsettling changes, and Europe, the old continent, is standing off to the side, watching the scene somewhat bewildered, as if it doesn't quite know whether to step into the game or stay in the stands.
Veränderungen, die die Welt sehr herausfordern.
Ja, da entsteht im Prinzip ein Vakuum, das irgendwie neu gefüllt werden muss. Und jetzt aus afrikanischer Sicht, wenn man jetzt mal historisch...
In a way, we're seeing a kind of vacuum emerging, a power vacuum that somehow needs to be filled again. And if we look at it from an African perspective, historically speaking, Africa was dominated by Europe during the colonial period. Later, with the independence of African states, Europe remained engaged, though in a different way. Then, from what I've seen and experienced, the United States also became a strong partner for many African countries in international cooperation. But now something is happening that leaves a certain void, and at least that's how it appears from an African point of view. The question is, how will this vacuum be filled?
Es gibt in der internationalen Politik kein Vakuum. Es ist auch kein Vakuum entstanden, sondern das...
Well, to begin with, in international politics, there is no such thing as a vacuum. The moment one player steps back, others rush in. So, when the United States retreats from certain regions or responsibilities, the space it leaves behind is immediately taken over. And unfortunately, mostly by authoritarian powers. China is there. At times, Turkey has been active. Iran has tried. Parts of the North African monarchies are involved. And of course, Russia is pushing in as well. In global politics, when someone leaves the room, that room doesn't stay empty. Someone else always moves in. And the only ones who don't seem to take part in this new game are the Europeans. Europe, quite frankly, stands on the sidelines, watching, somewhat stunned, as the others take over. That has a lot to do with Europe's history and design. The European project was never built to deal with world politics. It was built to keep us out of it. After all, when Europeans and especially we Germans got involved in world affairs in the past, the results were usually disastrous. That's why the founding idea of the European Union was to focus on ourselves, on internal peace and cooperation. For the big global issues, we relied on the United States and to some extent on France and the United Kingdom as permanent members of the UN Security Council. But now, if you look at today's conflicts, take the Middle East for instance, Europe plays no significant role. Even in the war between Russia and Ukraine, our role is limited to supporting Ukraine politically and economically. We have no influence over how or when this war might end. Russia wouldn't even consider negotiating with us. So, at the moment, we Europeans are like vegetarians in a world full of carnivores. That's pretty much our role right now. Well-intentioned, peaceful, but with little impact in a world that has turned rather rough.
Also wir gelten als Vegetarier in der Welt der Fleischfresser. Das ist ein bisschen unsere Rolle zurzeit.
Ja, ich würde ganz gerne etwas auf Energiepolitik zu sprechen kommen, jetzt vor diesem ganzen Hintergrund, den wir gerade besprechen.
Yes, I'd like to bring the discussion back a bit to energy policy, against this whole geopolitical background we've just described, but this time from an African perspective. Africa remains largely unelectrified. Many millions of people still have no reliable access to electricity. As a result, industrial activity in rural areas barely exists, simply because the infrastructure isn't there. African governments have been trying to change that for decades. But progress has been slow, and at the same time they're being courted from outside. For example, Russia is offering to build nuclear power plants in several African countries, which would of course give Moscow a certain influence in those regions. Other countries are also coming in with different technological offers. So now many African governments are wondering, how should we act? Which path should we take? Often, they tried to pursue several approaches at once. If we look back, Germany also went through an electrification process, though, of course, a long time ago. And in recent years, we too have faced serious challenges regarding our energy supply, both in Germany and in Europe as a whole. Do you see any parallels between Germany's experience and Africa's current situation, or are these completely different stories?
Deutschlands oder Europas anging. Können Sie da Parallelen ziehen? Sehen Sie da Parallelen oder sind das völlig unterschiedliche Stränge?
Also eigentlich nicht. Ich meine, die Elektrifizierung, die bei uns einherging mit der Industrie.
Well, not really, not in a direct sense. Germany's electrification came hand in hand with industrialization, and that process was driven by coal. We had our own domestic resources, which we used to build our industries. When those resources eventually became too expensive on the world market, we began importing them, not only natural gas from Russia, but also hard coal from elsewhere. In recent decades, we tried to move away from those fuels, mainly for climate protection reasons, not so much for independence. The idea that we might be dependent on someone else for energy didn't really trouble us, at least not until very recently, because even during the darkest days of the Cold War, the Russians always delivered their gas on time. Energy from Russia was never unreliable. So our motivation for renewable energy wasn't fear of dependence, but rather environmental and climate concerns, and the wish to phase out nuclear power. But of course, as our economy kept growing while we were phasing out coal and nuclear, our demand for energy continued to rise. And then, at the beginning of the 2000s, the European Union liberalized the energy market, meaning, in essence, that the state withdrew from its responsibility for energy security and left it to the private sector. And what did private companies do? They went for the cheapest available source, which happened to be Russian gas. That, in short, is the story of how our dependence was created. If we now talk about the next phase, the electrification of society as a whole, from electric cars to heating system powered by geothermal energy and electricity, we have to ask a new question. Where will we get the resources needed to build all these energy systems? And here we find ourselves dependent again, for example in battery technology, where we rely on rare earths that mostly come from China. Not so much from Africa, because Africa has in large part allowed China to take control of its mining sector. So we face a choice: be dependent on certain African states, some of which are politically unstable, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, or depend on China, which controls much of the global supply chain. What I'm trying to say is this: the idea that a modern industrialized economy in a globalized world can make itself completely self-sufficient, that's an illusion. We tried something like that once in Germany during the National Socialist period, when we even tried to mine low-quality iron ore right here in the region where we are sitting today. That experiment ended quickly because it was simply uneconomical. So when we talk about independence, we always have to ask, independence from what and in which areas? It depends on the kind of energy we are talking about, on the country's resources, and on its overall situation. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. In Africa's case, we should remember there isn't just one Africa, but 54 very different nations. The opportunities vary enormously. Some countries have access to the sea, others are landlocked, which alone changes the entire infrastructure reality. What is clear, though, is that renewable energy represents a major opportunity for Africa. in many parts of the continent, the solar radiation is far stronger than in Europe. That means it's possible to build decentralized, renewable mini-grids that are much cheaper than the centralized systems we built in the industrialized world. So renewables offer Africa a huge opportunity. Whether that can be achieved entirely without gas in the next 10 or 20 years, well, I'd put a question mark on that, but it is definitely a promising path for Africa's development.
Da würde ich mal ein Fragezeichen dran machen. Aber ich glaube, das ist schon eine große Chance für Afrika.
Ja, genau. Und so wie ich das sehe, so wie meine Firma es auch mitgestaltet, im Prinzip gehen die afrikanischen Staaten ja.
Yes, exactly. And from what I see, and also from what my own company is helping to shape, many African governments are indeed taking that two-track approach. On the one hand, they are expanding their central grid, but on the other hand, they've realized it's not economical to stretch that grid into very remote villages. That's why, over the next few years, several $1 billion will be invested in solar mini-grids, small modular systems that provide power locally. These grids are often operated by private companies that have emerged over the last 10 to 15 years. There are now several hundred of them across the continent. The big advantage is their flexibility. They can be built and expanded step by step. And you said earlier, there is no single solution, and that's true. In a way, we did the opposite here in Germany. We started with a very centralized systems and are now trying to make it more decentralized. We talk about microgrids, about building resilience into the network. The idea that certain parts of the grid can be separated if needed, or that individual businesses and households can rely on their own solar and battery systems if the main grid fails. African countries now have the chance to start from the other end, to build those decentralized systems first and then connect them into a larger network. You played a key role in shaping Germany's Energiewende, the energy transition. From that perspective, if you put yourself in the shoes of an African government starting almost from scratch, with little existing infrastructure, but with the opportunity to go directly towards decentralized energy, how could that work?
Wie kann das gelingen, wenn man jetzt von der anderen Seite kommt und eigentlich nichts hat und dezentral starten kann, aber das Zentrale auch ausbaut?
Traue mir nicht zu, da Ratschläge für afrikanische Staaten zu geben. Nur, gucken Sie, Deutschland ist eine der größten Volkswirtschaften der Welt.
Well, I'm always careful about giving advice to African governments. Their realities are very different from ours. But let's take a look at Germany as a point of reference. We are one of the world's largest industrialized economies, more than 80 million people living on a relatively small patch of land. Our major industrial centers are in the south and west, while most of our renewable energy potential lies in the north. We've made great progress with solar power, but if we're honest, there's still a huge gap between our installed capacity and the available output we can actually rely on. Wind power performs better, especially offshore, where the expansion has been much faster. But even then, we face a simple problem. The electricity generated in the north has to reach the industrial load centers in the south. That's why we still need a strong centralized grid. Decentralized networks are important, but if you power only one small villages, say Hahndorf, that doesn't help much when most people there work in Wolfsburg at Volkswagen. So for Germany, a centralized grid with a smart system of distribution networks, which themselves bring a certain degree of decentralization, remains the right structure. Now, what an African state should do is a much more complex question because the starting point is so different. But of course, centralized systems offer a great opportunity. The chance to bring electricity to remote areas without investing billions in large-scale transmission infrastructure. We've also learned that the way we calculate costs matters. If you look only at the cost of raw materials, the fuel you burn, then wind and sun are essentially free. That's why in the so-called merit order of energy pricing, renewables always come first. However, even in Germany, we are still struggling with the famous Dunkelflaute, those periods when there is no wind and no sun, and the grid comes under real stress. That's why we are now talking so much about energy storage. These storage systems can also be decentralized. They don't always have to be giant and expensive facilities. African countries will face similar questions. What happens when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, but you still have to keep a nearby factory running and households as well? So in that sense, the challenges are similar, but Africa can benefit from the lessons we've already learned. German companies, for instance, can adapt the know-how we've built up during our energy transition to Africa's very different conditions. And there is one big advantage. African countries don't have to spend 20 years and hundreds of billions of euros to make renewables competitive, as Germany did. We've already gone through that phase, and now the technologies are far more affordable and efficient than they were a decade or two ago. The same goes for networks. Smart grids, something I wish we had rolled out much faster and made mandatory in Germany, are crucial if we want to expand renewables successfully. They balance fluctuations in the grid and help keep the system stable and affordable. All those experiences, the lessons we've paid dearly for, can be used in Africa today.
All das sind Erfahrungen, die man in Afrika wird nutzen können.
Ja, Sie hatten vorhin mal gesagt...
Yes, and earlier you mentioned that Germany doesn't necessarily want to depend too much on certain African states, just as we're currently depending on China in some areas. From what I see in my own circle, though, among German industrial companies, there is now a growing willingness to diversify supply chains and look more seriously toward Africa, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Verstärkte Bereitschaft besteht, diese Lieferketten zu diversifizieren und auch nach Afrika zu schauen.
Ist ja auch richtig so.
Nicht?
Ich habe nur gemeint, es gibt zum Beispiel Demokratische Republik Kongo, da ist ganz viel Kongo und ganz wenig Demokratische Republik.
Well, what I meant earlier was this. When we talk about depending on African countries, we have to remember that not all partners are equally stable. Take, for example, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There's a lot of Congo in that country, but not much democracy. So if we integrate such countries into our supply chains, we need to be aware that it comes with significant risks. It's not that we can avoid risk altogether, we can't. But we have to manage and balance it carefully. And that's where diversification becomes the key strategy. Africa will play an increasingly important role in that diversification. But, and this is crucial, we should avoid repeating old mistakes. A good example is what happened years ago when people first started talking about harnessing the sun of the Sahara for energy in Europe. At that time, the whole discussion in Europe was focused almost entirely on one question: how do we get that electricity to Europe? We hardly talked about how African countries themselves could benefit from that solar energy, for example, by using it to power desalination plants in North Africa or to strengthen their own industries and societies. No, instead we looked at Africa mainly as a resource zone, as a place that could help us solve our problems in Europe. In hindsight, that was a very neo-colonial mindset. The whole Desertec project, which caused such a sensation at the time but never materialized, perhaps fortunately so, was driven by that perspective. We Europeans saw Africa's solar potential primarily as a way to fill our own energy gaps, to get electricity or hydrogen to us as quickly as possible. That's not the right approach. If we want true partnership, we have to start from the question of how these projects can actually contribute to Africa's own development, not just to Europe's energy security.
Kein Approach, mit dem man auf die Afrikaner zugehen sollte.
Ja, und ehrlich gesagt sehe ich...
Yes, and to be honest, I still see traces of that same mindset today in some of the current discussions about hydrogen. Maybe we've learned a few lessons since those early Desertec days. The plans for the big high-voltage transmission ring around the Mediterranean, for instance. But still, I notice that many of the old players are returning to their old habits. They carve out zones for themselves that are, in a sense, isolated from the host country's own systems. And they try to shield those projects as much as possible from local regulation or oversight. I really believe we need to have a much more open conversation about that and find new spaces, new frameworks for cooperation that are genuinely beneficial to both sides.
Und ich bin der Meinung, dass wir da dringend drüber sprechen müssen und hier vielleicht versuchen müssen.
Yes, but to be fair, that's probably the least of our problems. The real heavyweight in Africa right now is China. China is moving in aggressively to secure access to raw materials. And the Chinese approach is very different from ours. They don't ask questions about good governance, democracy, or child labor. They don't lecture anyone about human rights. Instead, they show up with ready-made offers. They build roads, railways, and ports, often with their own construction workers flown in from China. And in return, they secure long-term access to mining concessions and other resource projects. The European Union, in contrast, wants to apply higher standards, and that's good. But it also means that we have to be realistic. We can't expect African governments to turn down Chinese offers if we can't provide credible alternatives. Ultimately, it's also up to the African states themselves to recognize that good governance isn't just a Western demand. It's in their own best interest. Transparent, stable institutions attract investment. Corruption and political instability drive it away. And that's another major reason why investments in Africa are often more expensive. European banks, for instance, add significant risk premiums for projects on the continent because of fears of corruption, political upheaval, and regulatory uncertainty. That's an area where governments, including ours, can and should help. Through development banks like KfW, the state can reduce those risk premiums, for example, by offering guarantees or co-financing mechanisms. But at the end of the day, the real responsibility lies with the African governments themselves. They need to build the kind of trust that convinces international investors their money will be safe and that the rules won't suddenly change halfway through a project.
Es ist die Aufgabe der afrikanischen Staaten, dafür zu sorgen, dass Investoren mit Vertrauen zu ihnen kommen.
Ja, genau. Und
Exactly. And that's actually one of the core areas where we at Inensus are working on, regulation and legal frameworks for electricity supply in Africa. And of course, that ties directly into the hydrogen discussion as well. One key question we keep coming across is whether these hydrogen production facilities should be connected to the national grid to help stabilize it, or whether they should operate as standalone systems, independent of the local network. And I think there are still a lot of open topics to be worked through between the international investors and the governments of the countries that will host these projects.
Diese Anlagen beherbergen, beheimaten sollen
Aber wenn Sie
sozusagen.
nach Namibia gehen, die haben
If you take a look at Namibia, for example, it probably has one of the windiest regions in the entire world. There, a large number of wind farms are now being planned, and their purpose is not primarily to supply Europe with hydrogen, but to serve Namibia itself. The idea is to reduce the country's dependency on South Africa, which still generates most of its electricity from coal, and also to cut down on expensive oil and gas imports. So these projects first and foremost help Namibia, but of course, once the local demand is met, the country can also export hydrogen and generate revenues. These two goals, national self-sufficiency and export opportunities, don't contradict each other. They can go hand in hand. What's essential, though, is that a government takes a strategic approach, that it plans carefully what should happen where and for what purpose. And on the European side, I believe the European Union needs to engage much more actively with the African Union and its member states. Not just with single projects here and there, but with a more coherent long-term partnership strategy.
Mitgliedstaaten und die Afrikanische Union zugehen muss.
Zum Schluss noch mal einmal zurück.
Yes, and finally, I'd like to return once more to the topic of decentralized energy systems in Africa and the opportunities they might create for German industry. As I mentioned earlier, we are already in touch with several German companies that are seriously looking into how African resources could be accessed and processed locally under the specific conditions that exist there. The rapid drop in the cost of renewable technologies, solar, wind, hydropower and storage makes this more feasible than ever before. These technologies now make it possible to establish processing steps directly at the source in rural regions, rather than shipping raw materials abroad. I see this as a real opportunity not only to strengthen international cooperation, but also to drive rural industrialization and create local jobs. In the long run, that might even help reduce migration pressures. How do you see that connection?
Wie ist Ihre Sichtweise dazu?
Na, was das hier Migration angeht, da hat mir der frühere Generalsekretär...
Well, when it comes to migration, I once had a conversation that really stayed with me. It was with the late Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, a remarkable African leader. He told me something that completely challenged the way many Europeans think about this issue. He said, "You Europeans believe that when Africa becomes wealthier, fewer people will migrate to Europe. In reality, it will be the opposite. More people will come simply because more of them can afford the journey." And I think he was right, at least partly. Of course, there are also other studies that show the opposite effect, but his point was that economic development alone doesn't stop migration, at least not immediately. The African continent is going to double its population in the coming decades. That's an enormous demographic shift. And many millions of young people there are already prepared to move. They see the Mediterranean not as a dangerous sea, but almost as a large puddle between them and the opportunities they imagine in Europe. They won't try to go to America. Most of them will come here to Europe. And that will become the great challenge of the century for Europe. How to manage this process together with our African neighbors in a way that's fair, humane, and sustainable. Because if we fail, the sheer scale of migration could overwhelm us politically and socially. I remember once when I told the Egyptian president that it wasn't acceptable to simply arrest every political opponent. He looked at me with a straight face and said, "You're welcome to take them. How many 100 millions would you like?" It was meant as a joke, but it shows the scale of the issue, and that's something we Europeans still tend to underestimate. So no, I don't believe migration can be managed by a single policy instrument or solved through better energy supply alone. The wealth gap between even the more advanced African countries and Europe is still enormous. As long as life in Europe seems vastly safer and more prosperous, the desire to move will remain. And of course, when people face civil wars, corruption, or other grim circumstances at home, that desire only grows stronger. We have to look at that issue in a much broader context, not just through the lens of individual policies like electrification. That said, there is no question that if Africa is to develop economically, energy will be the key. Ideally clean and climate-friendly energy, and the best answer available right now is renewable energy. We are fortunate that these technologies now exist to make renewables work even in developing and emerging countries. You can see that clearly in China. Yes, they're still building coal and nuclear plants, but they're also constructing a massive number of wind farms and solar installations. So it's not the fossil fuels that are expanding most rapidly, it's the renewables. And that creates a real opportunity for technology partnership between Europe and Africa. At the same time, the geopolitical landscape is shifting. The United States is moving away from its close alignment with Europe. For the Europeans, that means we have to be very careful not to be squeezed between China and the US, two giants who increasingly see the world as their chessboard. That means Europe has to look for new partners in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, but above all, in Africa, our immediate neighbor. Perhaps we don't need to think only in terms of traditional free trade agreements. Maybe we can develop new forms of cooperation, partnerships that focus on technology, skills, and joint value creation, not just on exchanging raw materials. What definitely has to stop is the old pattern that coffee harvested in Africa but roasted and processed in Europe, or that we export cheap frozen chicken to Africa and in doing so destroy local farming industries there. Those are practices that have to change if we want Africans to take Europe seriously as a fair partner and not as a neo-colonial actor in a new disguise. And you can already see a new self-confidence emerging across Africa. If you watch CNN Africa, for example, you'll see a vibrant, confident continent full of ambition and creativity. That's an image we rarely see in Germany or in Europe in general. When I'm abroad, I like watching those African programs because they completely change your perspective. We Europeans are often a bit depressive these days. We feel like the golden age of Europe is coming to an end. But if you go to the global south, you'll find the opposite mood. There, people are optimistic. They are saying, now it's our turn. And they're right. It is their time. The best outcome would be if they rise in partnership with us, rather than in opposition to us. If we can work together out of mutual respect instead of retreating into fear and protectionism.
Das würden wir uns alle wünschen. Herzlichen Dank, Herr Gabriel.
Sehr gern.
Herzlichen Dank für die Einblicke.
Gern. Tschüss.
Tschüss.
Liebe Hörerinnen und Hörer, bevor wir schließen, möchte ich... Dear listeners, we would like to briefly put the discussion into context. On the world order. The changing global order in which more power is likely to shift toward the global south also presents major opportunities for Africa. The key question is whether African nations will be able to assert themselves in relation to emerging powers such as China, Russia, India, and Brazil, or whether they will fall into new dependencies. In many countries, the latter seems to be the current trend, but there is still time to change course. Rural industrialization driven by local enterprises could be a decisive factor in this transformation. On migration, former UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan once stated that as prosperity in Africa grows, more people may initially be able to migrate to Europe. This so-called migration hump is empirically well documented. Our own experience, however, paints a more nuanced picture. As mini-grid operators, and that is what most of our listeners are, we are in close contact with people in rural Africa, our customers, partners, and markets. For many, the cost of traveling to Europe is not the main obstacle. Migration is often financed collectively. Neighbors and family members contribute funds, and in return, they place strong expectations on the migrants. What matters less is absolute poverty and more the perceived difference in economic opportunity and security between home and Europe. Whether this disparity in prosperity will lead to a new wave of migration depends largely on how quickly the rise of the global south unfolds, and how much Africa participates in it. Mr. Gabriel is right. Isolated measures such as electrification alone will not prevent migration. Yet, this is precisely why microutilities in Africa play such an important role. They do not see electrification as an end in itself, but as a means to create jobs, income, and prosperity in rural areas. On access to African resources. As Mr. Gabriel mentioned, many African mines are currently operated by Chinese companies. However, the continent's resources are far from exhausted. There remains enormous potential for new locally anchored value creation. Decentralized energy supply through mini-grids can provide a crucial foundation for rural industrialization, complementing the expansion of national grids. On supply chains. From a German perspective, diversifying supply chains to include African resources and value-added processes is both sensible and necessary. Many German companies still have little experience working with African suppliers, and investments in the extraction or pre-processing of resources directly in Africa are often hard for them to imagine. At the same time, we are seeing increasing openness. A growing number of German industrial companies are willing to establish partnerships with African suppliers and to support them with the necessary know-how, training, and quality management. In areas such as production, documentation, and traceability, targeted financial support from public institutions could accelerate this positive development significantly. To make this possible, African suppliers also need to invest and position themselves strategically. Against this backdrop, Inensus and Construct have founded the German African Import Network, GAIN, a partnership between German industrial companies and African suppliers. GAIN helps both sides navigate the market, build relationships, and learn from one another. The German federal government is also improving the framework conditions for imports from Africa, for example through new financing instruments for African suppliers and additional measures aimed at strengthening fair trade relations. On hydrogen, much has changed in the hydrogen sector since the days of the Desertec project. Nevertheless, we observe that African countries with hydrogen ambitions have not yet fully realized their potential to manage and control these emerging markets. Inensus is committed to supporting them in doing so.
This episode of the Mini Grid Business has been brought to you by Inensus, your one-stop shop for sustainable mini-grids. For more information on how to make mini-grids work, visit our website, inensus.com, or contact us through the links in the show notes. The Mini Grid Business, powered by Inensus.